speaker, Dr. Keith Chen. He's an associate professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Business, and he'll be speaking to us today about language structure and intertemporal choice across the lifespan. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chen.
Thank you very much. I actually feel very lucky to be following Valerie because I think my talk picks up on a lot of themes that she's very, very skillfully introduced. I should mention that what we're going to be talking about today largely comes from kind of three different papers. So the first is already published, unfortunately, but the second two are working papers, and this is a very new research agenda for me, so I'm greatly looking forward to your feedback. I really, really appreciate it. Already a lot of the feedback that I've gotten just from informal discussions. So what we're going to be talking about today is effectively a framing effect. And the question is, if we're going to look for kind of strong and powerful framing effects out there in the world, well, this is actually how I was led to this research agenda. One very natural way of thinking about that is, out in the world there are many competing frames. So Valerie just talked about in this response to the last question, kind of differing political frames that are being endogenously kind of provided to the population by competing political parties. Can you find large, impactful framing effects out there in the world? Well, in some sense, you need to find a framing effect that constantly pushes in one direction, right? Otherwise, the kind of effects will kind of net out. And you'd like a framing effect that, in some sense, somebody doses themselves with multiple times a day, right? To kind of think about a long-running framing effect. What I'm looking at here is the degree to which the structure of your language provides exactly such a framing effect. And what we're going to be talking about today is whether or not the way in which your language kind of obliges you to frame time can have impacts on your intertemporal choice. Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to present to you a little bit of intuition and kind of try and place this within a large body of literature in cognitive science and experimental psychology, and within the linguistics literature in an area called pragmatics or temporal desis. I'm then going to present a good amount of research that effectively tries to establish that this effect measures the size of this effect and tries to establish that it exists out there in the real world in a few different ways. So one way is effectively an epidemiological method. I'm going to try and show you effectively match control experiments, match control comparisons with 150,000 families from around the world. Effectively, what we're going to find is that the way that language structures time, the way that your language grammatically structures time, is going to be very powerfully correlated with a lot of intertemporal choice. It's going to be negatively correlated with savings, retirement wealth, exercise, and long-run health. So think of all of these as activities in which you're asked to sacrifice in the present in exchange for benefit in the future. And we're going to find that it's positively correlated with a lot of intertemporal choices that have exactly the opposite feature. So for example, smoking and risky sexual behavior, activities that have pleasure in the present in exchange for pain in the future. Okay, we're going to try and isolate the channel of this, like I said, in a few different ways. Effectively, we're going to try and establish causality through these kinds of epidemiological matched controls. All right, so think of that as a technique from kind of epidemiology and from economics. I'm also going to show you some approaches from the linguistics and from the evolutionary biology literature that bear on this. These are, if you know these techniques, they're called phylogenetic techniques. Effectively, can we control for what we know about as the common descent and evolution of language in order to try and isolate causal pathways? You could think of this as kind of like structurally controlling for what we know about the relationship and the evolution of various languages. And finally, you'll notice that I am not I should emphasize that I can't go back for some reason. I should emphasize that I'm not a co-author on one of the papers that I'm presenting. There's recently a fascinating experiment where Matthias Suter got a relatively small but city in northern Italy, which has kind of native German and native Italian speakers, very, very much spatially intertwined. So families that, say, live on the same street. He somehow got that city to allow him to do experiments on all first through fifth graders in the city. Literally all first through, I think there were a few parents who didn't give consent, but I think he did like nearly 90%, nearly 90% coverage. So I can talk a little bit about those experiments because they kind of confirm some of the findings I'm going to talk with you about. And then finally, especially because we have access to this kind of data, experiments in kind of developing young children with respect to these effects, I think an interesting perspective that I thought would be particularly interesting to this audience is that we know a lot about the developmental path of the acquisition of language. All right? And so to the degree that we can talk about or think about the structure of language as a natural decision frame, as a natural nudge which affects a large variety of intertemporal choices, one way that we can think about that is to look at the parallel evolution within the kind of developmental cycle of patterns in intertemporal choice and patterns in language acquisition. So I'll present a little bit of work and evidence on that at the end. Okay. Let me first try and provide some intuition as to what we mean, or provide an intuition for how it's possible that language can have an effect on decision making. And I'm going to tie this to a kind of an experimental psychology literature that very, very large experimental psychology literature that shows that the power that language has in the cognitive domain. You know, unfortunately, there's this very negative connotation for an old literature that's called Worfianism, where kind of there was a period of time where people overclaimed it tremendously. Oh, you know, Eskimos have many, many words for snow, but no word for computer. So guess what? They're never going to be able to invent the computer because their language won't allow their cognition to stretch in that direction. But, I mean, we didn't have a word for computer before we invented the idea of computer. Like, you know, this idea that in some sense, the bounds of your language can function as a very tight bound on cognition has been proven. I mean, it's both logically kind of impossible and proven time and time again to be kind of very, very problematic, if not completely false. What cognitive psychologists have found in a tremendous number of very exciting studies, and some of which I can talk about, is that language does have a power to force attention. Right? In other words, the way that languages really do fundamentally differ is deep in their structure. They can force you every time that you have to kind of form a thought which you want to express verbally, to pay attention to certain aspects of a decision environment and perhaps less attention to others. So let me give you, so that's that feature, obligatory attention, that really is the one in which language is different. Let me give you an example of what that means. So my computer's frozen. Here we go. Okay. So for example, many of you can make snap judgments. You can get a gist. Keith is Chinese. You know, so for example, I've been meeting many fascinating people here, and Keith, you know, like, how long are you staying around? Would you like to have dinner tonight? Yeah, unfortunately, I can't. I actually have an uncle who lives in Northern California. I'm gonna meet up with him later. Okay, so you're all English speakers, and you immediately understood exactly what I meant. Okay. Now, differently though, if I were speaking to you in Mandarin Chinese, what I just said would be unacceptably vague. Okay, my language would not allow me to have just been so vague about the man that I'm meeting for dinner. And in what way? Well, if I were speaking with you in Mandarin Chinese, I would be forced by the nature of my language to encode a tremendous amount of additional information. I would be forced to tell you whether or not the man I'm meeting with is a relative on my mother's side or my father's side, whether or not I'm related to him by blood or just by marriage, and if, for example, he's my father's brother, whether or not he's older than or younger than my father. Okay? The structure of my language, or just my language, Mandarin Chinese, would force me to convey all of this information to you. I'm not allowed to kind of not think about it, for one, so that's the attentional frame, and I'm not allowed to not convey it to you. Okay? Now, that's this idea of obligatory attention, okay? And you could think about this as potentially a powerful nudge. The structure of my language forces me to attend to certain aspects of a decision problem. Why? Because, well, I can't speak correctly if I don't, all right? Now, we're going to think a lot about causality here because, for example, if I told you, well, you know, the Chinese language forces you to think very, very precisely about family relationships, that's why Chinese culture cares a lot about family relationships, you might think that I've gotten the causality exactly wrong. right? You might think that I flipped it exactly. And that's a tremendous danger. Now, I'll highlight this. One thing that's going to allow us to kind of disentangle that is a little bit of developmental time. This difference, this feature of language, is what linguists would call a lexical difference. I'm forced to tell you all of this information about my uncle because there's very precise words for each type of uncle in Chinese, and there's no general word uncle. Okay? Fortunately for us, or one form of variation we can think about is that these lexical differences can actually be shown to move quite rapidly in the evolution of language. We can obviously pick up new words and lose words quite, on a time scale relatively rapidly in a language. Grammatical differences, however, are much more kind of durable and long-lasting, and that's going to actually help us establish causality a little bit. All right. So the fortunate thing for me, I'm endlessly fascinated by family relationships in Chinese. But as a behavioral economist, what's much more interesting to me is that these kinds of differences also exist deep in language structures about how you're forced to pay attention to time. Okay? And it's these differences that also highlight grammatical differences in language structure. So for example, whereas back here, English was allowing me to be more vague about a family relationship, with respect to time, actually, English forces me to be much more precise. So for example, embedded in the grammar of English, many of you are English speakers, is a tensile structure, a modal structure. If you're experienced with the linguistic literature, tense, mood, and aspect. But for simplicity, let's talk about it as a tensile structure. If I'm speaking, for example, about past, present, and future events, I have to grammaticalize those differently. All right? I have to embed those differently in the ways that I speak. And in English, that's carried on the verb. It rained yesterday, the past tense. It is raining now, the present progressive, versus the future. It will rain tomorrow. Okay? Whereas Chinese was more precise about family relationships, in Chinese, these three events are spoken of in a grammatically identical way. Okay, so for example, if I say tonight, in Chinese, it's very comfortable for me to say something quite equivalent to tonight, I eat with uncle, right? Or if it's understood, why can't you, can you have dinner tonight, Keith? No, I eat with uncle. Okay, so in some sense, notice that, and you can observe this in usage. So for example, if you're going to go read Chinese newspapers, often in the first sentence of a paragraph, a time frame is established. We're talking about a political fight that we anticipate happening next week, okay? So the first sentence in an article will have some kind of marker of futurity to it. Thereafter, though, once that time frame is established, a Chinese newspaper just speaks entirely in the present tense. So for example, you can think of English as kind of encouraging a particular frame, which is future, 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 and Chinese encouraging a particular frame, which is future, present, 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 okay? So notice that the critical distinction here, the critical distinction of attention, is that English, because of this obligatory grammatical frame, encourages you or forces you every time you attempt to speak about a future event to, in some sense, grammatically distance that event from a present event, whereas languages that are tenseless don't require that grammatical distancing. And the question, hypothetically, is whether or not that grammatical distancing can lead to a psychological distancing, okay? Now, interestingly, so that's the hypothesis, okay? And the hypothesis would be, so let's break languages up, roughly speaking, into two different categories. Let's talk about future languages, which have an obligatory grammatical break between present and future events, and futureless languages in which kind of grammatically future and present events are spoken about identically. Now, it's actually the case that there are multiple dimensions. So for example, the median language on the planet has 3 temporally separated kind of future tenses, and some have up to 7. So like a hedernal future tense, it's not happening now, it's not about to happen, but it will happen before the sun rises tomorrow, is quite common. From a simple kind of perspective, and I'll show you kind of results and data on those more fine-grained distinctions soon. For now, I would just want us to think about a basic intuition about whether or not your language distances grammatically the future from the present versus not. Okay, now, let me quickly, because I know many people in the room have a background in psychology, and I think these experimental methods are fascinating, let me quickly talk about, do we have evidence that these obligatory distinctions actually have online cognitive effects? And the area that the cognitive psychology literature, I think, has demonstrated this most kind of powerfully is in the one of color distinction. So for example, English as a language, I'm going to assume most people in the room are native English speakers. English as a language has what are called like 11 basic color terms. But there are 2 languages on the planet. There are many languages that have many fewer. So for example, Japanese, before it came in contact with the West, used a single term for what we typically in English think of as blue and green. There weren't kind of separate words. And there are 2 languages on the planet that have more than English. So for example, Russian marks an obligatory distinction between light blue, which is goluboy, and dark blue, which is sine. If you're a Russian speaker, you're not allowed to just say blue, right? That you kind of recognize one as goluboy and one as sine. Hungarian has a similar red distinction. So so think of this as when a Russian speaker sees a swatch of blue, he can't just think blue. He's got to think either goluboy or sine. All right. So simple task: bring subjects into the lab, and what first appears is kind of a swatch of blue up at the top. A few seconds later, 2 swatches appear to the left and right. Simple task: quickly as you possibly can, hit the left or the right button. Okay? Now, allow people to train on this task for a while, and then you can imagine they asymptotically get faster. All right? Interesting finding, even when measuring that asymptotic kind of competency with this task, Russian speakers are systematically faster than English speakers at this task, as long as the 2 swatches of blue break the goluboy and sine border, but not if the 2 swatches of blue are both goluboy, and not if the 2 swatches of blue are both sine. Okay? So in some sense, hold the absolute wavelength distance between these 2 blues constant. Okay? It seems as if even in what feels like a very distinctly non-linguistic task, this obligatory breaking actually appears to have online cognitive effects. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about, so I just gave you kind of a very basic intuition why now an obligatory distinction between the present and the future might have online effects. What effect would we anticipate that having on intertemporal decision making? Well, I gave you a simple way of thinking about that. If your grammar kind of distances the future from the present obligatorily, and if that makes the present and the future feel psychically more distant, okay, if that occurs, then you might imagine that speaking a language like English, unfortunately for all of us, which grammatically distances the present from the future, might make it harder to save. Right? It may make it harder to kind of sacrifice in the present in exchange for the future, because those 2 states are more distant. Okay? There's a literature in linguistics called pragmatics and temporal dices that provides another way of gaining intuition for it. And this is intuition that you can ask yourself just by thinking internally, what am I doing when I speak in particular ways that linguists find interesting? Okay? I'm going to call these tense shifting strategies in language. Okay? So, for example, you'll often find you tell a friend a story. Oh my God, you're not going to believe this. I was walking down the street and I bump into Paul Krugman. And he says, blah, 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 blah. And I say, you're crazy, blah, 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 blah. And he says, blah, 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 blah. Notice that I've shifted into the present tense, right? He says, I say, you're crazy, he says. Why am I doing that? I'm clearly not suggesting that Paul Krugman is standing up here with me, right? This is a speech technique that's often called by linguists something called the historical present, and you actually see it quite systematically, not just in spoken but also in written speech in most languages on the planet. So, for example, Peter Rodman, you'll see this all the time amongst like historians. They talk about, Abraham Lincoln is suffering from a cold, right? He calls his cabinet into the office. What are you doing, right? Well, this is the earliest, in some sense, reference I could find to this phenomena. This is Longinus on the Sublime from the 1st century AD. It's effectively a 1st century Strunken White. It's long been noted by authors that this technique of shifting a temporally distant event into the present tense is used to make it feel closer, right? To make you feel as if you're kind of experiencing the event. So that's basically the intuition, that speaking about a temporally distant event in the same tensile structure as you speak about the present can make that event feel closer. Now, of course, you could imagine the opposite. What if we talk about a temporally close event in a distant tense? Does that have the opposite effect? Well, I can give you examples. Yeah, again, this isn't just an example from English, but this occurs in many situations. In almost all languages, these tense-shifting strategies implicate counterfactual construction. So, for example, suppose I say something like, "I wish I owned a car," or if I had a car, I'd give you a ride. Right? And what am I saying? You, as an English speaker, immediately understood that I'm implying I don't have a car and I can't give you a ride. But there was no official negation in that statement. What I'm doing here is by shifting a present event into the past tense, I'm indicating a different type of distance. I'm not trying to fool you into thinking that this is about the past. If I wanted to speak about the past, I'd have to double down. If I had had a car when I was a student, I would have been much more popular. Right? What I'm trying to indicate instead is distance in another form, and in this case, distance from current reality. I'm speaking in the past tense because I'm trying to indicate that I don't have a car. Okay? All right, so enough chit-chat. Let's get into data. So let me tell you a little bit about how would you measure obligatory grammatical encoding of the future versus the present. Well, fortunately, linguistic typologists do this all the time. They study this. You may encounter a typologist, linguist, somewhere walking down the street. A linguist, imagine, comes up to a person just walking down the street and says, "Excuse me, are you a native English speaker?" "Yeah, well, yes, I am. Would you mind helping me with my research?" "Fantastic, I'd love to help you with your research." Fantastic, let me provide you a context. The boy is expecting a sum of money. Okay? Then the next thing that the linguist does is he says to you, if the boy get the money, he'd buy a present for the girl. How do you respond? Normally you ask, "Are you sure you're a linguist?" Because that's terrible. And the linguist notes your apparent confusion and says, "Well, okay, let me ask, what's the simplest way that you would say that correctly?" All right? And if, for example, if you're an English speaker, you have to say, if the boy gets the money, he will buy a present for the girl. Okay? This is what we're going to code as obligatory encoding of future time, is that a speaker on the street feels obliged to tell the linguist that buy has to be turned into will buy. Okay? Obligatory grammatically encoding of future. All right? So you collect this type of data from all over, obviously not me. Linguists who are much better at this collect this type of data from all over the world, and this is what you get. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, but these are regions of the world: Western Europe, Eastern, obviously overweighted towards Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Africa and the Middle East, Australia, Asia. These names are obviously languages, right? And the color coding here is kind of language family. So, for example, here are the Romance languages. Here are the Germanic languages, right? Languages that this height means something, but for now, don't worry about that. Languages above this dark blue bar are futured. In other words, buy has to become will buy. All right? Languages below here are futureless from this perspective. It's perfectly fine to say the boy buy a present for the girl. Okay? Now, interestingly and useful for us, we can think a little bit about identification. Sometimes what's nice is, for example, English is actually a bit of an outlier amongst Germanic languages. So, for example, German speakers quite naturally say things like "Morgen regnet es," or "Morgen ist es kalt," or "Es regnet morgen." Basically, quite literally saying "tomorrow rain it," or "tomorrow is cold." Okay. Afrikaans is also an outlier amongst Germanic languages with respect to that. Hungarian is a Finno-Ugric outlier. So, on some level, if we worry about kind of coevolution of languages and particular cultural traits, one thing that we can do is kind of compare speakers of different languages during which this departure actually happened relatively recently. And of course, by recently, we mean on the scale of 1,000 years. Okay? The other thing we can do, like I was suggesting kind of epidemiological approaches, is effectively form matched control pairs. And how would that go? Well, I'll give you an intuition behind that. There are 9 countries around the world in which it's possible to form pairs of families within the same country, one that you can match them on numerous dimensions, but one family will speak a futured language and one family will speak a futureless language. So, for example, Canada is obviously a highly bilingual country, but French and English, unfortunately, have the same tensile structure, so it doesn't work. But, for example, Belgium, Switzerland, and Estonia are examples in Europe. Burkina Faso, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, and Ethiopia are examples in Africa, and Singapore and Malaysia are examples in Asia. All right? So what is that going to allow us to do? I'll kind of preview this match control pair thing. So for example, Nigeria is fortunately going to give us a fantastic amount of variation. I'll give you the intuition behind these match control pair experiments. You effectively take 1.4 billion buckets and put them on the ground. Okay? Then you just start taking families and you start pitching them into buckets. All right? Now, how do 2 families find their way? First of all, 90% of families find themselves alone in a bucket, and I mean, it's very boring. every now and then a family finds itself in the same bucket as another family. Well, that's fantastic. What allowed that to happen? They have to live in the same region of the same country. They have to be in the same income decile within that country. The head of the household has to have the exact same number of years of education. Same family structure. There's 6 ways of being married in Europe, it turns out. Same number of children and age of children, and attend the same church. So basically, you can see why you get to 1.4 billion buckets. You've got to match on all of these different dimensions this other family. That's lucky for the family. Now that they've met someone who they're very compatible with. These guys can go hang out. Lucky for us, and maybe unfortunately for them, sometimes they speak different languages. Okay, so that's what these types of countries are going to allow us to be able to construct. Okay, or sometimes even within fortunately within the same city. So Brussels is a fantastic example of this. Okay, let's hop into analyses. How much time do I have? Fantastic. Okay. All right. So 15 minutes. Let's blaze through this. The World Value Survey. Very, very large kind of sample survey. Roughly thinking capable of being matched to languages in particular countries. Think of 200,000 families around the world. We're going to look at savings behavior. So that's the response to this question. Family save. During the past year, did your family read out and code one answer? Save money, just get by. I don't really know what the difference is between these last 2 responses. But what we're going to be doing is basically fixed effect logit, or epidemiologists call this a conditional logit kind of approach to whether or not you answer, this year my family saved money. Okay, this year my family saved money. There's going to be a number of important controls. I'll highlight this one here at the bottom because I think this is one of the most interesting. Because I think one of the main confounds we have to worry about is cultural contamination. Here's an interesting question. Gentle family, here's a list of qualities that children can be encouraged to learn at home. Which of these, if any, do you consider to be especially important? I'm going to code a variable called teaching children to save is important, which basically says amongst these values, you said that teaching children to thrift and saving money in things is an important value. Okay? Approximately 37% of all families answered that that's an important thing to teach children. I mean, why is that nice? Well, because if you think that intertemporal kind of choice may have a cultural component, and presumably that's transmitted from parent to child. All right. There's a lot of stuff going on here. This has not only, in many of these regressions, I'll show you not only family fixed effects, but clustering at the family level, if you know what that means. If not, it's not important. Basically, here's how I want you, here's one way of thinking about it. All of these results are odds ratios. Okay, so what this is, so a strong, this is linguistic terminology, strong future time reference. This is families that speak languages who obligatorily break the future from the present. Okay, what does this as an odds ratio mean? Well, 0.46. This is with only age and sex controls. 0.46 means looking across the world, only controlling for age and sex of the head of household. So think of these as exogenous characteristics. A family that speaks a language that breaks the future from the present is only 46% as likely to report having saved this year as a family that doesn't. No control. So think of this as like, just basically comparing means. And you want to think about how much of that is causal. Okay? Now start adding controls. So the kind of legal origin or kind of the origin of kind of a lot of government functions of the country, per capita GDP, unemployment rate in the country, real interest rate in the country, UN reported legal rights index in the country, average level of trust in the country. As many of you know, the social capital literature focuses a lot on trust variable. Family is important. Language share, what percent of my country speaks the same language that I do? FTR share, what percent of my country speaks a language with the same time structure as mine? This means that these results aren't being, helps you know that these results aren't being driven by kind of minority languages. Okay? Continent fixed effects, what continent am I on? So if you'll notice these basically we're throwing in a huge number of controls, and this odds ratio isn't really changing. So one way of thinking about this is that you throw in a lot of country-level characteristics that doesn't seem to have any impact on the measured effect of language on savings. Okay? So think of this as like the cross-country coefficient. Now, let's, other ways to break it up. You can do this regression separately on each different continent at different levels of development. You see very, very consistent results. Now we start getting interesting. Now let's do that matched control family experiment. So now we're going to start matching families. So we're only going to compare families that are identical on all of those dimensions I talked about before: income decile, education level, living in what country and responding in what year, sex, age, married, cross number of children. We can include religion in this as well, and it doesn't change anything. This is just to remember what the cross-country coefficient was. Notice that a lot of that attenuates once you add in country controls. So now we're only comparing people who live in the same country and families who are identical, and then slowly adding in all of these controls about how identical families are going to be on numerous dimensions. I think the interesting pattern, and I think it tells us a lot, is that once we include that level of control, in some sense, once we get down to comparing very similar families, instead of looking cross-country, the odds ratio the odds ratio gets weaker and goes to about 0.72. But after that, all of these additional controls, religion, income, education, age, all of these things seem to have no effect. Okay, they appear to have no effect. By the way, basically everything I'm going to show you is significant at the 1% level, even after clustering at the country level. Okay? Yeah, and you can see that idea that, like, as you add more and more of these controls, you can actually talk about many fewer families, because it's very unlikely that you find yourself in a bucket with another family. Okay? So think about this number as, roughly speaking, what we want to think about. If your family speaks a language that breaks the future from the present, even only comparing you with virtually identical families, you're 30% less likely to report having saved in any given year. All right? These are the countries in which that's being identified. I talked about those before. These are countries with within-country language variation, and here's the coefficients separately in each country. Very, very consistent. Okay. Now, more interesting here, I'm an economist. I'm obviously obsessed with savings rates, but there's other kind of important things that we can look at. Okay. So this is the Survey of Health and Retirement in Europe. It's a much more detailed survey than the World Value Survey. Here they actually come in and they say, listen, would you be willing to have me evaluate the value of your home? Would you mind, do you know what a stock is? I guess so. Would you mind telling me how much stocks you hold? It turns out retired households in Europe are incredibly patient and willing to take a nearly 2-day-long survey. Okay? Basically, okay, so I'll just summarize these results. There is basically identical set of controls to the earlier analysis. What you see is that families, even controlling for their income, so hold constant the income stream over the lifespan, if you speak a language that breaks the future from the present, you retire with 40% less in retirement savings, which suggests you haven't been saving as much over the lifespan. Now remember, though, whereas the World Value Survey was identified in all 9 of those countries around the world, unfortunately the European survey is identified only off of Belgium and Switzerland. Okay, now then why would you look at a survey that's only identified off of Belgium and Switzerland? Well, because there, it actually allows you to look at a lot, it's the survey of health and retirement in Europe. It lets you look at a wider range of intertemporal kind of decisions, many of which are kind of health related. So all of those controls, so take basically 2 families that on all of these measurable dimensions both live in Brussels, attend the same church, identical on all of these dimensions. Let's see, so the German speaker is 24% less likely to smoke than the French speaker. Okay, maybe that's not so surprising. You could think about French people. They're 30% more likely to be physically active at retirement. They're 13% more likely to be obese. Again, this is the French versus the German. Okay, 13% more likely to be obese. One common measure of long-run health in the medical literature is grip strength. So, retired European household, would you mind squeezing this device in your dominant hand as hard as you can? This is maximum grip strength in kilogram force units. So, if your language breaks the future from the present, you retire with a less strong grip. If your language breaks the future from the present, this is maximum exhalatory flow, like blow as hard as you can into this tube, 16 liters per minute squared. Thing, right? I'm doing this because I wanted to show you actually every long-run health measure that was reported in the share that has some kind of intertemporal component. I'm trying not to kind of censor here. In fact, actually, I'm showing you walking speed, even though there was not a significant effect on walking speed. Walking speed. This as a smaller sample. It's a little bit weird. It's like retired European household. Do you have a hallway in your house at least 10 meters long? If you do, would you mind me timing you walking down it at a comfortable pace? That's normally taken as a measure of long-run health. So you would expect a negative coefficient, right? That if you're in worse health, you're going to walk more slowly. On the other hand, if you discount the future stronger, maybe you want to walk faster. So I'm not sure exactly what the theoretical prediction here is, but there's no effect. Okay, is this only a European developed country phenomena? We can find different surveys that give us health this is the Demographic and Health Survey. It's run by the UN in developing countries in Africa. You see in Africa an identical smoking result. Basically, remember the smoking result here. Basically statistically identical smoking result in Africa, an identical obesity result in Africa. These are, do you use contraception within your family to manage the number of children you have? There's an obvious theoretical prediction that's borne out in that answer, again, with all of these same controls. I find it amazing that people answer this, but the last time you had sex with someone who wasn't your partner, did you use a condom? That's a strange question, but if your language breaks the future from the present, you're less likely to say yes. Okay, it appears that national savings rates, so this is I'm going to blast through here now. These are the OECD countries and the average percent of their GDP that they saved from 1985 to present. You can see why Greece is in trouble, right? They're all the way down here. The prediction would say that the light blue bars, countries which primary language does not split the future from the present, should be saving more. So these light blue bars should be tolerant over to the left. Okay, they appear to be. In a controlled setting, these are Modigliani kind of regressions. The average effect appears to be 5 percentage points of GDP. So that's actually a very, very considerable effect. For example, that's far more than the recent recession knocked off of U.S. GDP. Okay, so think of this as a relatively strong effect. Okay. Okay, so those are the health effects. Now, let's talk a little bit about other ways that you can get at this. Now, I kind of highlighted a few of these ex ante. You can try and use phylogenetic techniques, and effectively what that says is, well, so listen, you're controlling for all of these features of households, but what we may be worried about is just kind of the co-diffusion of language and particular cultural traits. Okay, so for example, here's a map of this is how the languages on the planet kind of map out with respect to kind of either breaking or not breaking the future from the present. Here is kind of the unexplained component of their savings rates. So you see a large correlation between the dots here and here, but how do we know that that's not being driven by, I don't know, co-diffusion of some other value? Okay. Now, part of that's being controlled by, when you control for education, you could think about the co-diffusion that helps control, for example, a potential co-diffusion of linguistic grammatical traits with, for example, a cultural value towards education. Okay. But, can you control for every possible co-diffusion? So these phylogenetic techniques, I'll just kind of highlight how this would work. These phylogenetic techniques effectively say, linguists know a lot about how languages co-evolved. And in some sense, you can construct a phylogenetic tree of how languages evolved. How do we know that? Well, linguists do all of these kinds of fancy things. How many phonemes do you share in common? How similar are your grammatical structures? We have, like, for example, data on, we have archaeological data that suggests when did people first get to this region that has olive trees, okay? Well, does your language have similar words for olive or not? Right? If you have effectively the same word for olive, you probably split after you migrated through the region with olive trees. If you have different words for olive, you probably split before you migrated through the region with olive trees. So they do this. You construct the phylogenetic tree, and then effectively what you do is you structurally try and control for that evolution. Right? You say, we see a high level of correlation between kind of savings behavior and this particular grammatical structure. Is it possible that, how much of that is explained by the tree structure? And the answer is none of it. The answer is none of it. I was very surprised to find this. I actually, this analysis came out of, I'm a co-author on this paper, but this analysis came out of a hostile reaction from some phylogenetic computational linguists. And we just made an ex-ante bet. Okay, I understand the intuition behind the test you want to run. Let's publish the paper either way. Another way that you can think about it is suppose that you thought that that was a problem. Another way that you can think about it is, well, let's take every feature of language that we can imagine, okay, that's been measured systematically by linguists around a wide variety of languages, and let's just like run them all through this kind of analysis. So you have this intuition that the way that a language breaks up time would affect intertemporal choice. If that's just a spurious correlation, why don't we do a placebo test with how a language treats the past tense? Why don't we do a placebo test with how whether subject comes first or verb comes first in your grammar? Just kind of general features of language. And what you find, this is the time feature here. So if you see, it fits the savings data much, much better than basically 99.5% of other grammatical features of language, which is actually kind of surprising because you can imagine a lot of these are very highly correlated. But that gives you another way of thinking about confidence about this. Okay, how many minutes left? Is it 1 minute left? 3 minutes left. Okay, let's talk a little bit about so to summarize, all right, it appears as if there's a very, very strong kind of correlation across the world, which survives a lot of things which you would hope would give you some handle on whether or not this is a spurious kind of correlation about the relationship between the structure of time in your language and intertemporal choice, all right? And effectively think about that as a framing effect. So your language, and this is a grammatical feature that was determined thousands of years ago, your language either obliges you to merge the future and the present or not, all right? If you merge the future and the present in your grammar, you appear to be more patient in a number of different intertemporal tasks. Okay. Now, interestingly, we can think about that as and I think the experimental evidence I'll tell you a little bit about in the last minute suggests that that's a very, very weak framing effect, but one that doesn't seem to attenuate over time. The effect of it appears to, if anything, pick up and accumulate over time as people provide it to themselves multiple times. Okay, hundreds, if not thousands, of times a day. Okay. Now, from a developmental perspective, we can. I think that has some interesting implications that we can think about. So there's only one kind of relatively large sample study that looks at the evolution of speech and in particular tensile structure in children. So these are matched pairs of English and German children on numerous demographics of their families. This is from Sazgan, 1978. And what you see here is effectively, English and German-speaking children look very, very similar in their usage of the future tense. All right, up until approximately age 4, and then you see an inflection where German-speaking children then begin to kind of decline in their use of the future tense until it approaches its kind of adult level, which is much, much lower than that of English speakers. Okay. So the question is whether or not these patterns, if this hypothesis is correct, if these developmental patterns in language acquisition, and specifically the feature of language that you're interested in, maps onto those behavioral changes. Okay, so actually, wait, why is it not here? Oh, I know why. Okay, I'm out of time, but I'll highlight and show you these recent experimental results because I think this is fascinating. I don't understand how somebody can be so convincing as to get a whole city to allow them to experiment on all of the children who live in this city, between ages in grades 1 through 5, and then actually not all but many children in the city younger than that. But effectively what you can find is that even going down on the level of street fixed effects, so take children who attend the same church and live on the same street in this small northern Italian city, which is 50.7% German speaking, so as close to a 50-50 city as possible. Basically, young German children between grades 1 through 5 actually show marked differences even after controlling for IQ and family characteristics, marked greater intertemporal patience than their Italian counterparts, but no differences in risk behavior. And this difference goes away if you look at German versus Italian-speaking children before the time of departure in their tensile structure. Okay, so in other words, the developmental path also appears to concur. So, I'll just kind of leave you with that. There seems to be kind of a tremendous amount of evidence that we have this kind of strong framing effect, that it's present and indicates a wide kind of, a very, very kind of common feature of intertemporal decision personal framing that appears to cut across a wide variety of personal behaviors, and it appears to show kind of in some sense an early lifespan developmental path that's concurrent with the theory. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I just want to pick up on the very last point that you had, and you didn't indicate what tasks these were, but I assume these were sort of more experimental tasks, where there's actually a very sort of explicit sort of mention of time. So thinking
they're
sort of
just to summarize, they're marshmallow type tasks, like would you like 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows?
Okay, so but there's sort of very sort of verbatim kind of sort of processing of there's a particular time involved here. You're stating what the time trade-offs are.
Correct.
So I'm curious if you take the typical sort of measures that economists try to use of time preferences, again using sort of very verbatim kinds of game-based tasks where you're mentioning explicitly what these time units are and how many years or days and hours in the future, would you actually see that all of these effects on those sort of so-called measures of those deep economic sort of time preference and discount rates? Or once people are thinking about it in verbatim terms, do you not see this? And really this is reflecting incredibly pernicious biases that people are sort of not behaving according to their sort of fundamental preferences.
Good. I think that's a fascinating question, and I realize that I have some results that speak to that. Let me show you. Let me show you those. I'm really grateful for the question because I think it's possible that I missed one what might be the most kind of interesting result. So one way to get at that is to look at kind of a conscious kind of elicitation of a value. Okay, it's not exactly kind of a direct economic kind of game measure. We don't kind of have those in large surveys. But so remember, I talked about this variable. Do you think it's important to teach children to save? Okay, so think about this as a conscious elicitation of whether or not you think savings is an important value. Okay, even after all of that match control pairing that I told you about. Maybe unsurprisingly, families that say it's important to teach their children to save 11% more often. Okay. What's interesting is that's actually statistically orthogonal to the language effect. In other words, if you take families that appear to self-state that savings is an important value, how powerful is the language effect? 30%. Take families that say that savings is not an important value. How important is the language effect? 30%. So in some sense, in a factor analysis, it's almost as if this is a pernicious subconscious effect, which is not. Yes, so actually, it turns out both conditionally and unconditionally, they're uncorrelated in the data. In other words, this language difference does not appear to affect your consciously stated importance on saving. Yeah, well, it's bizarre, but yeah. Sure.
This will be really quick. In your 1,500 qualities of language that may or may not have made this prediction, I think there were a couple that actually did as well or better. What were they?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So one of them was double negation in word order. So it's like if your language allows you double negation, where does it come in word order? Like so in it's like after the subject, for example. And then the other one was number of genders in your language. So we don't mean like male, female. We mean kind of, there are many languages with 7 genders. So like big things, sharp things, small things, cute things, diminutives, like all of these have different ways of, being spoken about in your language. So I have no kind of ex-ante theoretical reason why either of those appear to be very, very strongly correlated with savings behavior. One thing that you just can say is that through the coevolution of languages, a lot of grammatical features are strongly correlated with each other. So it's not actually that surprising that even if you found you thought that there was a strong causal relationship between this grammatical feature and that other grammatical features that through accidents of history are highly correlated with this would also be correlated with savings.
And that's true. Those three do co-evolve.
Yes. Those things are, at least in the data, those things are highly, both in final nodes in languages, highly correlated in observed language characteristics around the world, and actually their believed development tree in the phylogenetic kind of tree are also very highly correlated. Yeah.
Fascinating, really good.
Whoa.
Sorry.
Yes, it was.
We're on and off. Yeah. A couple of comments, and I just kind of would like your reactions to it. And
Sure.
And my mind goes to trying to draw connections between this and kind of how we might actually intervene with people around changing behavior. One of the things that came to mind for me was this was a really interesting connection for me is. In work that we do in treating addictions, oftentimes we really do take a very present-oriented focus with people. Like AA has the one day at a time idea.
Yeah.
When people want to stop drinking, they're often reluctant to really commit to anything over a long stretch of time. So we might do with them what we call like sobriety sampling, where we say, well, what would you be willing to do? Maybe you'd just be willing to not drink until tomorrow or 2 days. Like we shorten the time frame to be very present oriented. And I'm seeing what you're presenting, and it's making me kind of think about to what extent the present is really important in making healthy behavior choices.
Yeah.
And I mean, we generally focus so much on trying to get people to look at consequences, things that are future oriented, that are and then if they can't do that, then we say they've got a bias in their judgment, or they're impulsive, or we're not making decisions, we're properly weighting the future, or we're not getting somehow we're not weighting things out. And so it's setting up in my mind this question of, so what's the role of the past and the future in informing our decisions around our behavior, and what's the role of the present? And I'm wondering if maybe does your data suggest that, behaviors themselves are really shaped more by this focus on the present, and that maybe the past and the future, maybe they set a course for us. Maybe our gist is influenced by the past and the future, but really what's going to shape the actual behaviors is more focused on the present. And so I just this is what's sort of going on in my mind.
Yeah,
as I'm
I think that's right.
Piecing this
And
together, I'm interested in your thoughts about it as you've seen your data and what other people are doing.
So I think one intuition for this is that if my language kind of naturally encourages me to take future decision making and move it into a present frame, then that actually appears to have positive effects. Right, and precisely kind of, that seems to jive with some of the intuition you have. Look, I'm much more of a data guy than an experimental guy. I've never done experiments on humans. But, so for example, anecdotally, you can see things like a lot of self-help kind of programs ask you to kind of make lists of goals. And actually, it's a relatively common feature that they ask you to make those lists in the present tense. Some people have asked me, are you suggesting that we should all learn Mandarin? I don't know, or Finnish, or there's a number of languages that are tenseless. Obviously, you can't kind of advocate that. Although I do think these interesting little, so for example, we talked about Hal's work, right, in the kind of roundtable yesterday. And the strong impact of, for example, in the particular moment of a decision, there seems to be a strong impact of taking a digital picture of you, aging it, and then presenting it in the corner of the page, right? So in some sense, what I would say is that this work, maybe think of this as epidemiological work that maps out the scope of commonly observed important real-world behaviors that appear to depend on this one kind of, we'll think of it as a principal component, right? And then, hopefully kind of interventions that can change that future-present framing will have, what I think what this suggests, it has the potential to kind of affect a whole galaxy of behaviors and not just any one of them.
Could I just really quickly ask a follow-up question exactly to that?
Okay.
One of about German, and you saw that in your findings, that the Germans,
In German, you have the capacity to mark the future.
Yeah, the Werder form.
Right, we're just
Yeah.
too lazy to kind of do it most of the time. So wouldn't there be a natural experiment right there where you put people in a situation where you activate the explicit future frame as separated from the present versus not? I mean, I understand. I love the fact that you're looking at languages and using a correlational approach, right? But I mean, that would seem to me the right experimental way to follow up.
I think that's right. I mean, I have been working with a few people and thinking about such kind of an experimental approach. And actually, German is a fantastic example because there is this Werder form that's just rarely used. In kind of, for example, like German weather reports almost never use the Werder form. So you could, for example, do syntactic priming and then randomize and then try and get that to happen. I worry a little bit that if somebody's syntactically primed to use the Werder form, they're also kind of feeling a little more formal, right? Because it is kind of more formal, right? I think I do agree that I think there's potential for a true randomized experiment here. My intuition is that the base effect is probably pretty weak, and we'd need a very, very large sample size. But I mean, I'm in contact with the people who got the entire Italian city to do so, South Tyrolean Italian city. So let's hope. Fingers crossed.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
You explained the differences from having these grammatical differences. How do you explain why certain cultures develop them from an evolutionary point of view to begin with?
Why some languages have this grammatical feature and others don't? Yeah. So in some sense, I think that's a critical point. That we like I talked about these phylogenetic techniques in some sense, where I try and control for the fact that what we know about the evolution of these features. There is a literature in linguistics that talks about why particular grammatical structures appear or disappear. Tell you the truth, and I mean, I don't want to speak for linguists, but tell you the truth, I think that literature has proceeded at a relatively slow kind of pace because of it is considered kind of dirty in some sense to ask like why a particular, it sounds a little too Worfian to them, like why a particular feature evolves. But we do know a little bit. So for example, we know that English English gained this obligatory distinction between the transition from Old English to Middle English. And it's about the same time when it lost the German casing system. The most recent change on this dimension is that Brazilian Portuguese has lost the inflectional future tense that European Portuguese has. So Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese are mutually intelligible, but Brazilian Portuguese speak in a futureless way that they actually also, for their level of development, save a lot. I believe that the weight of the literature in linguistics suggests that these grammatical features of a language actually evolve relatively randomly or in conjunction with the evolution of other. For example, when you lose the case system, word order becomes much more rigid, and this type of tensile structure becomes more important for not kind of having conversational implicatures confusing conversational implicatures. I don't believe that there's any evidence so far, at least in the linguistics literature, that these grammatical features evolve in a way that's concurrent with some kind of a behavioral change they instigate. Although obviously that's a natural hypothesis.
How many people on the planet are in this Venn diagram who have training in economics and training in linguistics?
How many people on the planet have training both in economics and linguistics? I believe, well, I don't know any other. Okay, so I'll just say that. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, it's a great combination.
Oh, thanks. All right, cool. Well, thank you guys for your feedback.